Late 1944, the German border. American GIs of the 28th Infantry Division clear a command bunker, weapons ready for a final, desperate fight. But the figures who emerge with hands in the air are not hardened soldiers. They are a dozen young women in the gray-green uniforms of the Wehrmacht. These are the Helferinnen, female auxiliaries, telephone operators and clerks. For years, Goebbels' propaganda has painted a terrifying picture of their captors. The GIs are just as stunned. Their field manuals have precise instructions for male POWs, but on the subject of uniformed enemy women, the pages are blank. That moment of confusion in the bunker was a microcosm of a crisis rippling through Allied high command. This wasn't about a dozen women, but the over 500,000 who served the Third Reich. Their fate wouldn't be decided in a distant Texas camp, but in the immediate chaos of a collapsing Europe. Allied commanders, from the front lines to the Supreme Headquarters, were utterly unprepared. The Geneva Convention, the sacred rule-book of warfare, had been written for male soldiers. These uniformed women fell into a terrifying legal void, forcing a question with no easy answer. In the midst of total war, what happens to an enemy the rules forgot? To understand the answer, you must first understand the problem. And by early 1945, the Allied problem was overwhelming success. The Western Front was drowning in prisoners. In France, Belgium, and now on German soil, the Allied armies held over 2 million captured German soldiers. And with intelligence predicting the final, total collapse of the Reich within months, planners at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force, SHAEF, were forecasting a surge to over 5 million. This wasn't a victory parade. It was a logistical bomb, ticking inside an already overstretched system. Every ship used to transport prisoners back to the US or Britain was a ship not carrying ammunition, fuel, or replacements to the front. Every soldier assigned to guard a POW camp was a rifleman pulled from a line that was still taking casualties. Every calorie fed to a German captive was a calorie diverted from a supply chain that was already struggling to feed its own armies and the starving civilians of liberated Europe. The system was stretched to its breaking point, and into this crisis walked the Helferinnen. They weren't a tidal wave, not at first, just a steady, unexpected stream. A few dozen here, 100 there. But as Allied armies pushed deeper into Germany, they began overrunning the massive administrative and communications hubs of the Reich. Suddenly, the numbers were in the thousands, then tens of thousands. For the men at SHAEF, this was not a moral dilemma. It was a mathematical one, an unforeseen variable thrown into an equation that was already failing. There were no facilities for women, no established procedures for processing them, no female guards to oversee them. The Geneva Convention offered guidance for captured nurses and doctors, but it was silent on uniformed clerks, telephone operators, and anti-aircraft auxiliaries. These women represented a complete system failure, and with the entire Allied war machine groaning under the weight of millions of male prisoners, there was no time, no money, and no manpower to build a new system from scratch. A conventional solution was impossible. An unconventional one had to be invented, fast. The answer came on March 10, 1945. It wasn't a battle plan, but a single, decisive cable from Supreme Headquarters. The directive was a masterpiece of legal and logistical pragmatism. Instead of granting the millions of surrendering German personnel, including the Helferinnen, formal prisoner of war status, they would be classified under a new ad hoc designation, Disarmed Enemy Forces, or DEF. This wasn't just semantics. It was a fundamental shift in the rules of captivity. POW status was a legal shield, guaranteeing rights under the Geneva Convention, transport to secure camps, specific rations, and oversight by the International Red Cross. The DEF status simply erased that shield. It meant these captives would not be shipped to the United States or Britain. They would be held in temporary, open-air enclosures inside a devastated Germany, under Allied military control, but outside the formal protection of international law. In the stark choice between upholding the spirit of the convention and managing the collapse of an entire front, Schaeff had made a ruthless, practical calculation. And with a single stroke of a pen, this bureaucratic decision set the stage for a humanitarian crisis of its own making. For the captured Helferinnen, the abstract legal term Disarmed Enemy Forces became a brutal physical reality. The expected journey to a structured camp in America or Britain never happened. Instead, they were marched into sprawling, hastily constructed enclosures, many of them part of the infamous Rheinwiesenlager, the Rhine meadow camps. These were not camps in any conventional sense. They were vast open fields, often churned to mud, surrounded by little more than barbed wire and watchtowers. There were no barracks, no kitchens, no latrines. For the first few weeks, tens of thousands of captives, men and women, were left exposed to the elements, digging holes in the ground for shelter against the rain and the cold April nights. The systematic cruelty and violence the women had been taught to expect from Allied soldiers was, for the most part, absent. The enemy here was not a person. It was something far more indifferent: administrative collapse. The Allied supply chain, already strained to its limits, simply could not cope. The result was institutionalized neglect. Food was scarce and sporadic. A piece of hard bread, a thin soup. Dysentery and typhus swept through the enclosures. The struggle was not against a brutal guard, but against hunger, disease, and exposure. Inside this chaos, Allied intelligence teams began a monumental task: sorting the human wreckage of the Third Reich. Their primary tool was a 131-question document known as the Fragebogen. This questionnaire was the centerpiece of the denazification program, designed to methodically categorize every German adult. For the women in the enclosures, it was a terrifying interrogation on paper. They were asked about their membership in the Nazi Party and its affiliated organizations, their parents' political leanings, their personal beliefs. The answers would determine their fate. Based on the Fragebogen and follow-up interviews, each woman was placed into a category, from major offender to exonerated. But the process was riddled with inconsistencies. An exhausted G2 intelligence officer, working through hundreds of cases a day, might interpret a defiant answer as proof of fanaticism. Another might see it as simple pride. A woman who had been a low-level clerk but had joined the party for career advancement could be classified alongside a committed ideologue. In the mud of the Rhine meadows, a life's trajectory could be altered by a checkmark in the wrong box. From diaries and post-war memoirs, we see their perspective shift. The initial, paralyzing fear of their captors, fueled by years of propaganda, slowly dissolved into the monotonous, grinding reality of survival. One former signals operator later wrote of the endless gnawing uncertainty. They formed small, tight-knit groups for mutual protection and support. A woman with nursing skills might find herself tending to the sick in a makeshift infirmary, earning a slightly better ration. Another who could sew might mend a guard's uniform in exchange for cigarettes, which became the camp currency. Their view of the Allies transformed. The monstrous caricatures of propaganda were replaced by a confusing collage of individuals. A young, indifferent G1 on guard duty, a harried officer trying to maintain order, a sympathetic medic offering a rare word of kindness. The enemy was no longer a terrifying monolith, but an unpredictable and disorganized force of nature. This proximity created a problem Allied command had not anticipated, but perhaps should have: fraternization. General Eisenhower had issued a strict non-fraternization policy, forbidding personal contact between Allied personnel and the German population. The order officially extended to the DEFs. Posters in Allied billets warned that every German is a potential source of trouble. But policy is not reality. In the strange intimacy of the enclosures, the lines blurred. a shared cigarette through a barbed wire fence, a traded piece of chocolate for information, a quiet conversation in broken English and German. These small acts of humanity chipped away at the official wall of separation. For camp commanders, this was a constant security nightmare. Clandestine relationships developed, driven by loneliness, pity, and opportunism on both sides. Every interaction was a potential breach of discipline and a security risk. But while the women struggled for daily survival and their guards struggled to enforce impossible rules, their collective fate was not being decided in the mud of the Rhine. It was being debated in quiet, sanitized offices hundreds of miles away. And the logic being applied had little to do with the Fragebogen and everything to do with the cold, hard calculus of rebuilding a continent. That designation, Disarmed Enemy Forces, carried a quiet, brutal logic. Outside the full protection of the Geneva Convention, DEFs were not legally entitled to the same ration scales as formal prisoners of war. But the final, decisive twist in their fate wasn't about rations or rules. It came from the Allied military government as it confronted a problem bigger than any single battle: the looming total collapse of German civil society. By summer 1945, the challenge was no longer defeating Germany, but preventing it from ceasing to function. Hospitals needed nurses, post offices needed clerks, city administrations needed staff, and the Allies realized they were holding the solution captive. These women were no longer a logistical burden, they were a vital pool of skilled labor. The calculus of war had been replaced by the calculus of reconstruction. The decision was made. The Helferinnen were no longer a problem to be contained, but an asset to be deployed. Their release was now a strategic necessity. The execution of this new strategy was as swift and impersonal as its creation. Throughout the summer of 1945, in DEF enclosures across the American and British zones, the process began. There was no grand announcement, no ceremony of liberation. One morning, a group of women would simply be called forward. An officer, looking tired and detached, would read their names from a list. Each woman was then handed a single, cheaply mimeographed sheet of paper. This was their discharge document, officially terminating their status as disarmed enemy forces. There were no apologies for the conditions they had endured, no handshakes. A guard would escort them to the main gate, unlatch it, and point down a dusty, rubble-strewn road. This was freedom, and for many, it was a moment of profound terror. The structured misery of the camp was replaced by the absolute uncertainty of a shattered world. They were released into the ruins of their own country, with nothing but the clothes on their backs. Their homes could be gone, their families dead or missing, and that flimsy discharge paper, their only proof of identity, might be completely useless for crossing into a different Allied occupation zone, just a few miles away. The gate closed behind them. Their captivity had ended, but their war was far from over. And so we return to that moment at the war's edge, the confused GIs and the terrified Helferinnen. The answer to what happens to an enemy the rules forgot is not a story of good versus evil. Their fate was sealed not by malice, but by spreadsheets, not by benevolence, but by logistical necessity. The designation Disarmed Enemy Forces was a bureaucratic tool that erased their legal rights, but also kept them in Germany when they were needed for reconstruction. The absence of the systematic brutality they were taught to expect was not a sign of moral superiority. It was the byproduct of a system too overwhelmed to be organized in its cruelty, and later too pragmatic to waste a resource. Their story is a case study in how the laws of war disintegrate under the sheer scale of a modern total conflict, creating a gray zone where the destinies of thousands are decided by convenience. For the women of the Wehrmacht, the war didn't end with the surrender of an army. It ended with a single sheet of paper, a discharge that was both a pardon from captivity and a sentence to a new, undeclared war for survival.